Classical mythologies have shaped the very world we live in.
Yeah, whatever. I don't have time for dense, dusty old books, Paul.
Great. Well, that's what podcasts are for.
Oh, good point.
Join me, Paul, as I teach my best friend and improv comedy partner, Sarah, all about mythology on Myth Understood.
Mythology is frequently explicit, obscene, violent, and bizarre, though, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to joke about and improvise along the way?
Yes.
Oh.
So come for the mythology and stay for the absurdity on Myth Understood.
Available now at mythunderstoodpodcast.com and your podcast platform of choice.
It's Myth Understood.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Are you ready to ask some questions? I'm ready to answer some questions because today's episode of Don't Quill the Messenger, revealing the truth of Shakespeare authorship, is a special episode where we invite two special guests here into the studio to ask their questions about the Shakespeare Authorship Question and the Shakespeare Authorship Mystery. We welcome today writer, poet, and fellow podcaster Alexandra Hoey, as well as actor, podcaster, and award-winning filmmaker Jake Lloyd.
I have waited so long for this.
Just to see me, right?
Yes, I have waited so long just to see you.
Well, I am gracing you with my presence, and you can now seek the answers to everything you've always wanted to know.
Oh, don't open that door. That's not a door you want to open.
That's a dangerous door, I think.
I want to thank you both for taking some time out to join me here today on Don't Quill the Messenger, because I think it's important for our listeners to know that they are not alone.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of experts and a lot of professional scholars who come here into the series and talk about the authorship question or aspects of the Shakespeare authorship mystery, their particular candidates for who they believe the author is, most prominently Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And for some listeners, that can be a little jarring, a little bit head cloudy.
It's a lot.
I like to say people get sacked by the S.A.Q. Because S.A.Q. You get it?
Yes, yes,
I get it.
Good.
Yeah.
Anyway, so if you're feeling
we're not scholars, but we know what letters mean.
Great,
right?
I'm glad. If you feel a little sacked by the S.A.Q., then this is the episode for you, because Alexandra and Jake are going to let us know a little bit about some of the questions they have being introduced to this topic, and I'm going to do my best to answer them.
Sure. Well, first, Alexandra, what's your background with Shakespeare?
Well, I have an English degree, so naturally, of course, I have studied Shakespeare at points throughout that process, but not as much as I think some other people. I took only one course that was dedicated toward tragedies and romances, and otherwise just had like sprinklings of his plays throughout my college experience, and a little bit, of course, in high school, as we all do. But, you know, I've just always loved poetry and writing and stories. And so I was drawn to Shakespeare's works even as a young kid, you know, probably when my mom showed me the 1968 Romeo and Juliet and made me close my eyes when Romeo's butt came on screen.
Olivia Hussey.
Olivia Hussey, yes.
Yeah, that's a very
Beautiful
famous
lady.
scene. There's a nude scene, and she was under the age of 18 at the time that it was filmed, so it was very, very controversial.
Scandalous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
Scandal and Shakespeare? No.
Those two things have nothing to do with
So
each
do
other.
you have a favorite play?
you know, I go back and forth a lot, and I think in the recent years I've landed on The Tempest. When I was younger, I think the first play I really loved, because I first saw Romeo and Juliet, and of course I liked that as like an 8-year-old girl. Oh, romance, it's so lovely. But once I got out of that phase, I loved Othello, because I had studied it in school, and I loved Iago. And to this day, like, that character is maybe the best villain of all time, still in my mind. again, or Macbeth. I don't know, but between the two, I go back and forth.
I say Thanos, but that's a
Really?
completely different situation. I
Really?
suppose.
Thanos is
And
the
we
best
whip it
villain
right
of all
back
time.
around.
Jokes.
Well, I don't think you could have Thanos without any of.
That's probably true.
Okay, so I would argue that I would agree with you that Iago is definitely one of the best villains of all time, and I have theories as to why that is. But I would say that you can't compare Iago to Macbeth because Macbeth isn't a villain; he's an anti-hero.
This is true, and it's still incredibly compelling. I think on that level, in that context of that play, he's in my mind. I think Lady Macbeth is maybe even more evil.
So
but
you like the bad guys?
I do.
How do you feel about Richard III?
Now that's another play I did have to study in college, and to the point where we watched Finding Richard, Al Pacino's
Sure,
documentary.
sure.
So if I can interject, that is my past with Shakespeare.
That's when you were introduced.
Well, 'cause here's-
Pacino?
as a 35-year-old white guy nerd, Shakespeare it seemed too difficult for me. It was that's the way that it felt when I was young. And then we had to study a bit of it in high school, and we were shown Finding Richard. And it pretty much, like, I wouldn't have any interest in Shakespeare if it wasn't for, like, Al Pacino and Baz Luhrmann. Do you know what I mean? Like that
Okay.
Romeo and Juliet.
They
Like,
made it hit for you.
Okay, sure,
really
sure.
true. And that was my access point to it. And then I would, study theater in college, in which I got to play Richard III in what I'm going to argue was the absolute worst presentation of Richard III ever presented in the history of Shakespeare. And I'll never.
Did you wear a hunch?
I'll
Did you
never
wear a
forget.
hump on your back?
I didn't wear a hunch, but I walked. I had an affected walk.
Okay.
And it was very important for some reason that to my Professor Goodwin, I'll never forget her name, that didn't affect any sort of accent or voice. She really wanted everybody just to speak in a normal voice. She wanted the words to matter more than like a caricature performance. Now, the problem with that is that I am from Long Island, and I'm not sure if you can hear it in my voice. Obviously, I'm doing it on, but I have a dense Long Island accent, even more so when I was a college kid on Long Island. And I'll never forget the oration to his army. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to remember here, the final words are, shall they ravage our lands and lie with our daughters? Maybe those are the final words. And I remember I was doing so good, Steve, so good, until those last few moments when I muttered, lie with our daughters. And you could hear the collective audience go, ugh. And it was the worst. Like the Long Island accent was just so prevalent. But honestly, that documentary, that Finding Richard, like that's really what piqued my interest in Shakespeare as an artist.
Right.
Because it was an access point. It was people that I was familiar with that had Kevin Spacey, if I'm not mistaken.
A few big names.
Winona Ryder was in that as well. One of the Baldwins.
I've seen it, but I don't remember who all the star power
Right.
was. But I have seen the film, and Pacino did a great job with bringing Shakespeare to students in that way.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of students who are familiar with that film. Many students are familiar with Mel Gibson's Hamlet because there was like a compendium documentary that went with that helped students study Hamlet, which, P.S., by the way, people call it Mel Gibson's Hamlet. It's actually Franco Zeffirelli's Hamlet starring Mel Gibson.
Right.
Franco Zeffirelli, same director as that Romeo and Juliet we
Yes.
were just talking about.
Yep.
And
I never knew
also,
that.
You didn't know that?
yes.
Yeah.
And Zeffirelli is also the director of the very famous film version of Taming of the Shrew
Right.
with now why are their names jumping out of my head?
Because you're on the
Burton.
spot. There you go.
Burton and Taylor. Thank you. It came to me. See,
Nice.
it's all in there.
Right. Get
Just
access.
got to access the files.
The wheels are turning real
Sure.
fast.
Yes. But if you're into Shakespeare villains and you haven't seen Titus Andronicus and you don't know who Aaron the Moor is, then you're in for a treat. You definitely need to
Right.
look into
Well,
that
we'll
one.
add it to our movie bin.
There you go. There is a version. There's a film version called Titus.
Mhm.
Julie Taymor is the director.
Oh.
It's superbly artistic in a way that makes absolutely no sense.
Is that late 90s, early 2000s?
Yes.
Blue cover.
Yes.
I worked at Blockbuster, and I remember the cover. It's weird because I access
it's Anthony Hopkins.
Yep, Anthony Hopkins is the cover. And
He is the cover.
It's just a
yes.
close-up of his face, and it's completely tinted blue, and I remember the covers so vividly, and I always went, oh, I should give this a shot one day, and I never watched it.
You never did.
It's also full of star power.
Right,
Jessica Lange.
I remember it was a big deal when it came out.
The big Broadway star. If I use this reference because you're such a 35-year-old nerd, you'll know it. He played Nightcrawler in the X-Men movies.
Oh, Alan Cumming.
Alan Cumming, thank you.
Yes.
You could do 6 degrees of Shakespeare here right now.
You could have named another movie other than X-Men, and I would have gotten that one. But good call, though. That was smart. That was the easiest access point.
You got it right away,
Right,
so
sure,
clearly
sure.
it worked.
We could go on $64,000 question. We'd do great.
Yeah, there you go.
So that's great. So you guys have like at least a grasp of some of the Shakespeare canon and familiarity with some of the characters and the plays. What do you know about Shakespeare the writer?
Well,
Go ahead. You go first.
Miss English major.
yeah, pretty much for every English class, whenever Shakespeare came up, and then of course for the dedicated course I took, you always had the intro bio portion of the class, learning his birth year, 1564 or something like that, and then his death, 1616. I remember that. Yeah, and the man Stratford-upon-Avon, and just knowing he was married to Anne Hathaway, and basically a layman's man, as we were just talking about ourselves. I remember in the last dedicated course, the tragedies and romances, the professor I had, who is a playwright and is a very staunch Stratfordian, day one addressed the question of his authorship and said, a lot of people out there, critics, playwrights, so they have a lot of theories, but we won't ever be discussing that in this class. That's never going to come up because I much prefer the image of, Shakespeare as the man of Stratford-upon-Avon and this everyday man than all the other theories anyway, and he found it very romantic. And that was something that was like really drilled into the students in this class.
Did you get the feeling that he, by saying I prefer that he was sort of admitting that this is probably not the truth?
I think he was trying to be considerate because he was a very considerate person. So, and I think there were other students in the class who had taken other Shakespeare courses. And so maybe they had already heard other theories, on the Oxfordian theory. I have no doubt. But in this particular course, he really was just like, shut that down, lock it away. Because
I'm such the rebel. If I were in a class, I'd have to like raise my hand and say, I'd much prefer that climate change isn't real, but guess what?
Sure.
I'd much prefer not to have to sit here in this class, but guess what?
Sure.
What I prefer isn't connected to truth in any way whatsoever.
Yeah, some facts in a school? Sure.
right.
Sure.
But you're right. That is a common thing among a lot of people in academia, is that's what they prefer to believe, and they don't care to know truth or to examine truth or to even ask a question or raise an eyebrow. However, I would argue that it's their job in the halls of academia to promote critical thinking and questioning, which is what this program tries to do on a regular basis.
Yeah, and you know what? So that's actually... the questioning is what sparked my interest in this topic. I'll pull the curtain back, of course. I produce this show. I'm the co-founder of Dragon Wagon Radio. And
pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
when this show...
yes, he is the great Oz.
And when this concept was presented with me, I had zero information about this. 100%, I wasn't even truly aware that there was an authorship debate. I just thought that there was a mystery about William Shakespeare, this person,
which is true separately.
Sure, and
she sounds like a Shakespeare authorship scholar already.
Well, and I think that's the interesting thing to me is that this has become fascinating to me because I've said it to you before personally, Steve, and I think that listeners of this show, if you are an authorship, what's the word, doubter? I don't know if you're interested in the authorship question, then television shows like Adam Ruins Everything, which I've mentioned to you before, and Penn and Teller Showtime show BS. We'll save it for the sake of keeping the explicit rating. I feel like those shows really pique my interest because they take something and they use facts and science to question whether or not something is reality, the way something is presented. Whether or not there's truth in that, or inversely, why is it presented that way, even if it is true? And learning more about specifically the thing that is mind-boggling to me is this birthplace trust, and about how this to me, it sounds like Loch Ness. It sounds like
that's a great analogy. I like that analogy, and it's not unlike Loch Ness or the Winchester
51.
Mansion in San Jose, for instance, right? Area 51, or maybe not Area 51 so much as Roswell, New Mexico.
Roswell, that's what I meant. Yes.
Right, because obviously you can't go to Area 51 isn't a tourist destination, but Roswell has made a ton of money off of that whole alien mystique.
Right.
But this is different in the sense that it's the opposite mythology that's happening there, right? So whereas with places like the Winchester House, which is supposedly haunted, or Area 51, which is supposedly housing aliens, the Birthplace Trust is supposedly housing what they constitute as fact and what a lot of the world has just blindly accepted as fact.
Sure.
And then when you scratch on the surface, you find out there's not enough fact to back it up at all.
Sure.
And so if you're interested in knowing more about the Birthplace Trust, for instance, they're the ones who are propagating. Well, I guess in the sense it is sort of like Roswell, New Mexico, and that they're propagating the myth in order to make the money.
Right. Yeah. And I find money very interesting because in the things that I am fascinated about within my political views and the things, not to make this too political, but the fact that the NRA is what it is in our country today just allows me to open this door to being like, oh yeah, no, the authorship question could 100% be a valid question, because this is something that we see right now in modern society, the way that money affects everything and the way that money affects the way information is delivered. And so back in a time when you didn't even have the tools of social media to deliver things in mass, it makes perfect sense how easy it must have been just to accept what you're told and move on with your day. It fascinates me the fact that this guy Shakespeare, from what I've learned, is his Shakespeare. I had no idea that this dude wasn't even attributed the works until years after he was already gone.
That's right. That's exactly true. So let's do this, since you two represent by proxy the listening audience who also are fairly new to this issue or this question, or have learned about it at some point in education, but it was dismissed by a professor, or you never looked into it again until you found this podcast. Ask some questions. Tell me where you're at with it. Tell me what you have learned, what intrigues you about it, and then tell me what smells. What's the big? Tell me about the big elephant in your room that you feel people are ignoring, but the peanut shells keep getting higher and higher.
I find it really interesting how easily I drank the Kool-Aid in that class. I was like, all right, yeah. Now, after talking about Oxfordian theory with Jake a little bit and learning about this podcast, the things that stand out for me are, it comes down to evidence, right? How do you prove this? And it's so challenging.
Let me ask you this. Do we know the very first person to ever say oh, that was the guy? Do we know who that is?
I think it was listed in a book at one point, right?
But okay. So basically what it comes down to is when the first folio is published in 1623.
Okay.
Which is 7 years after the man from Stratford has died in 1616, as you remembered from your college courses.
Oh. They repeat it so much.
She wrote it on her hand. Don't believe her. No, I'm kidding.
In 1623, Ben Jonson, who is the ranking poet playwright of the day, writes this preface to the folio, and he has a big hand in the folio's publication. Ironically, though, and what Oxfordians will point out all the time, is that the folio is dedicated to two men, two earls, the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery. One of them is the son-in-law of Edward de Vere. The other one is the brother to that man who was supposed to be another son-in-law to Edward de Vere, but that marriage fell through. So for whatever reason, Edward de Vere's son-in-law and a man who he wanted to be his son-in-law, the brother of his son-in-law, end up becoming the two noblemen who this publication is dedicated to. Now, an Oxfordian would argue, well, that's because they had the manuscripts.
Oh, right. They were the ones who gave them.
And they gave them to Johnson and said, publish these, but you've got to do it secretly and you've got to do it without people knowing where they came from, et cetera, et cetera.
But at this point, was the name William Shakespeare already being used?
The name William Shakespeare had been used for quite some time. It first appears on the two epic poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, which, of course, are both dedicated to the Earl of Southampton.
Okay.
Right. And there are a lot of theories about why he would dedicate works to the Earl of Southampton, none of which the Stratfordians can actually connect to whatsoever.
Would the man from Stratford even know who the Earl of, what did you just say? I missed it.
The Earl of Southampton.
Southampton even was? Would he even know who he was?
It's quite possible that a lot of people would have known who he was. He was, obviously a famous Earl.
I guess I was asking, like, is that,
But to know him personally, there's absolutely no literary connection whatsoever.
I mean, in fairness, I do dedicate all of my work to people I've never met.
Of course. I'd like to dedicate today's podcast to Jill Simpson of Idaho.
Sure, yeah.
Well, there's a Jill Simpson out there that's
you
really
said that.
exciting.
I'm
you
sure
just blew someone's mind right now.
Yes, Jill, I'm talking to you.
Oh my God.
You're welcome. So that's where we get and there are these references in the folio to Stratford, not directly Stratford, but Avon, the sweet swan of Avon, thy Stratford monument is mentioned. So it's really, that's when we first connect Stratford to
Stratford the place, not even the man yet.
Stratford the place.
Not even the man yet. Okay.
To William Shakespeare.
Interesting. Okay.
Right. And a lot of people have different theories about this. Some say, well, it's just a coincidence that William Shakespeare and William Shakespeare have names so similar.
Yeah.
Some argue that that was by design, that he was being used as a front or as a facade to hide the true author.
So are you saying that there's a possibility in the world where the author of the work, crediting himself as William Shakespeare, knew William Shakespeare existed?
That is a possibility.
Interesting.
But it's also possible that he didn't know at all.
Oh, okay.
And
that
it's
pure coincidence.
that it's a pure coincidence.
Sure.
Or that it's a coincidence of convenience.
Oh, okay.
Right? Because I believe that the name William Shakespeare, and in oftentimes in publication, it's spelled with a hyphen.
I've seen that. Yeah.
Right? There are a number of publications where the name appears hyphenated. And if you think about those two words, Shakespeare, to brandish a spear, right, or to be a spear shaker, is the connotation. Well, Edward de Vere was the Queen's champion jouster and known as her champion spear shaker. He was also known...
Was spear shaker a common term for a jouster?
I don't know that that's true.
Oh, okay.
But I do know that he was nicknamed
the
spear shaker.
The spear shaker, gotcha.
And I also know that he had an affinity for the goddess Athena. Pallas Athena, most often known to be a patroness of the arts, as well as to commonly be shown with a spear.
Oh, okay.
Right. She is she is the spear shaker goddess.
Right.
So many people believe that he chose the name William Shakespeare as a pseudonym. He was making a play on words.
Right.
Now, doesn't it make sense that the guy who wrote some 35,000 different words, by the way, he had in his vocabulary, would make a play on words in creating a name for himself?
Right. One might even call him a wordsmith.
Well, according to the research that I have done, the author's neologism, that's called That's
a lot of points in Scrabble right there.
Thank you. Yes. Neologism. Neo, new. Logism, logic, word.
Right.
New words.
Oh.
His prowess at creating words or phrases that had never been seen before in print goes to the total of some 7,000 words. The average college graduate in today's America has an active verbal vocabulary of about 5,000 words and a written vocabulary of about 10,000 words.
Wow.
So this is a guy who invented more words than most people can even speak.
Yeah, jeez.
And used more words in his writing, 3 times as many words
Sure.
as any other person in modern times today.
Okay.
But he did all of that with an elementary school education from Stratford, England. Right.
Well, okay, so let's get back to that connection too, because this is the other thing that I'm probably most fascinated about, and that is, so we have the first folio you said is published, and that's what connects Stratford the place.
Yes.
And maybe his name purposely matched a name, maybe it didn't. Fine. Who was the first person to be then like, oh yeah, there's a guy from that place I know called Shakespeare. That's got to be the guy. His name is almost similar. Like, is there a definitive time where that guy got the credit versus just the place?
Well, if you go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, there is a page that talks about sort of the history of that there with a much better timeline than I'm able to give you.
Sure. Yeah.
And also talks about the timeline of the authorship question and when we first start to see people expressing doubts. Now, we have a scholar, actually the vice president of the organization, who has been a guest on this program a couple of times, Brian Wildenthal.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a new book coming out that's all about the early authorship doubts.
Interesting.
And there's a lot of reference out there from writers of the time who are basically hinting at the fact that this is a pseudonym, that this is a fake name.
Even back then, they were like,
even back then, they hint. Several of them talk about Edward de Vere being this masterful playwright. If we could only find out what he's doing, if he could only let his works be made public.
That's fascinating, especially if the idea is that they're peers of his.
Mm-hmm.
Because then it's sort of like everybody. It's like,
nudging.
They're all at the they're all at the tavern at the end of the night, like bumping elbows. Like, can you believe this guy? He's not putting out his work. What are there plays published by Edward de Vere with the name Edward de Vere?
No, none. None that we have. None that we've found or that we have.
So we have record. Well, there is record of people saying like he's a great playwright, yet there are no plays that exist.
That's exactly right.
And he was known as a great poet, though, in the time, right?
His early poetry is not nearly as... De Vere's poetry is not nearly as good as the finished works published under the name Shakespeare. But a lot of scholars have been able to point to phrases, turns of words, references that are very similar. And you can see in some of the poems how the early thoughts and themes of those poems are then later reflected in the sonnets, particularly, which is definitely...
It's almost like a forensic science sort of thing, like a linguistic science.
It is very much. And there is a science out there called stylometrics that uses computers and whatnot, and nothing definitive has ever been really produced from that.
Right.
And it's because we don't really have a control.
Right. Yeah.
We have nothing else that Shakespeare ever wrote.
Interesting.
Other than his will. Which he probably didn't write. He probably dictated verbally to somebody who wrote it, which could be construed as his actual words. But if they are, and that is true, they are the flat and unstylized and boring.
They're his off day.
When I write a grocery list, I would not call it a poem. Like typically, it's
right.
It's a different voice.
And what we see in the will is not somebody who ever had a literary life whatsoever.
Right.
There's no mention of any literary life. There's no mention of any literary things for his life. So it looks like either he was a convenient front or it's just a coincidence that has been propagated by people who sought to make money off of it and have been making money off of it for a very long time.
Okay, so speaking of making money off of it for a very long time, are there like dates or is there information on when Stratford was like, oh yeah, Shakespeare, he came from here. Hey, I'll give you $1 to look at the grass he walks on. Like, do we know when that began?
That was actually started by an actor.
Oh, that's it. Close the case. An actor making it look a buck. That's the most believable thing I've ever heard in my life.
It was started by a very famous actor. His name's David Garrick. If you look him up, you'll see great pictures. Some you've probably seen etchings of Garrick in performance as some of the various famous Shakespearean characters. Some of the oldest depictions of an actor playing roles like Hamlet or Richard III. He was very famous Richard III.
Wow.
Are David Garrick. And he made a lot of money off of Shakespeare. And he staged what was known as the first Shakespeare Jubilee in Stratford.
Like a festival kind of thing?
It was the first Shakespeare festival. I used to run a Shakespeare festival in Redlands, California for almost 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And so we can thank David Garrick for the very first Shakespeare. For people in Ashland and in Alabama and in Utah, those are the three most prominent Shakespeare festivals in this country today. They can all thank David Garrick for the inventing of the Shakespeare Festival.
How long after Shakespeare's death did that happen?
153 years.
153. Is that, I mean, that's close enough to where Shakespeare might have had like family still there?
No.
Oh, no, not that. No. I guess people are only living to be like 22 around this time.
His family's died out, right?
No, and as far as that goes, like it's all anecdotal.
Oh, okay.
Like, there's this legend of him supposedly poaching deer. There's no proof of any of that. It was, this person told that.
I guess
person.
the reason I was asking was I was curious if any of Shakespeare's family, like, his lineage would attended this festival and capitalized on it. Went like, yeah, that was my great uncle.
There was a guy who popped up in the middle of the 18th century, not long after Garrick starts making all of his money, who claimed to be like the illegitimate grandson of Shakespeare or something like that. I can't think of his name right now. I want to say it's Davenant, William Davenant. And he starts claiming that he's a descendant of Shakespeare.
Right.
And he starts doing adaptations of Shakespeare's plays and changing the endings and making them happy endings and condensing them down. Garrick did the same thing. Garrick's Richard III is known for its happy ending. I don't know how.
A happy ending?
How on earth did that work out?
I don't know. He went into a Korean massage parlor. I'm not sure. But
let's work on that hump.
That was a birth of a whole new genre, it sounds like.
Yeah. So, people were making money. It was all about making money. In fact, Garrick has this 150th Jubilee. It's 153 years since Stratford's death, but he claims that it's the 150th anniversary. So he totally just lies about the date.
I mean, 3 years, it's not that big of a difference.
Because the calendar could be changed.
Right,
so
right.
The thing is we have this history among the Stratford myth,
right,
and its promulgation of just changing things to suit their need, to just making it up if they have to.
Well, no social media to hold you accountable.
Well, apparently, you're still not accountable.
Yeah, right.
So I have another question. Is there anybody in De Vere's world, or even in other, because there's Marlowe is another, people say that he's a potential candidate, Francis Bacon, right?
Yes.
Which, by the way, my last name is, Lloyd is my middle name, and I go by just Jake Lloyd professionally, but my last name is actually Bacon. So I would just like to say here that I am a direct descendant of Francis Bacon, and that he wrote. No, I'm kidding. I don't know. You can just make stuff up. Is what I thought.
You can. Go ahead. Go run with that. You might do just if you end up with a birthplace trust behind
if I own it, right,
you'll do very well.
I'm like, hey, I'm a great something of Francis Bacon. Anyways, is there anybody from those candidates' lives that maybe ever came forward and said like, oh yeah, this is the person who actually wrote? Is there anybody that knew De Vere that was like, oh, he is the writer, he is the person named William Shakespeare, and then they were shunned, like that kind of thing?
None that I'm aware of, any like outward.
Right.
And it seems as though there may have been some sort of edict among the family to maintain the secret to that degree.
Okay.
Now remember, when we say secret, people knew. It's obvious that people knew. So like a lot of people will go, well, how did they keep this a secret from the whole world for so long? Or how did he hide his identity from Elizabethan England? Well, it seems to me, based on the research and the evidence that exists, is that it was a known secret. Right. That there were other writers who wrote other things anonymously or under pseudonyms, oftentimes to protect themselves because a lot of what they wrote was subversive or considered subversive against the Queen. You're talking about an era, like I don't think we quite understand how controlled society was during that time. Like she has the power to kill for any and all reasons.
One word.
Like we might today talk about, and it kind of cracks me up being a historian, is that, people will talk about the fascism that we are suffering in today's America. And I just laugh. I have to laugh because like we have no idea. But when you have a sovereign ruler who can turn and say, I'm going to cut off your hands because you wrote something I didn't like, that's real. That's a real thing.
And not that it doesn't happen in today's world. Maybe not where we are, but
not where we are.
Yeah, I mean, someone could argue that certain parts of Korea or Saudi Arabia, then this sort of thing is kind of understandable. Of how
you could equate it to journalists who get killed in foreign countries, for instance, because of what they write.
Right.
It's very similar to that.
But the difference is that those awful dictators and rulers have to use subversion tactics, whereas it sounds like Queen Elizabeth was just like, oh, he said that? Kill him.
There was a very legitimate reason to conceal your identity if you were going to write something that could be construed as subversive against the crown or against high-ranking members of court.
Even just criticism in general, right?
And look at the plays. I mean, the plays are laced with criticism of the crown. They're laced with criticism of members of the court, including flat-out mockery of some of the highest members of government. And the idea that this country bumpkin from Stratford would get away with that and not end up dead, that in itself is a pretty ridiculous idea.
Interesting. Oh, okay. So what you're saying is that if it was the man from Stratford, he probably would have never he probably wouldn't have lived even as long as he did.
No, no way. Ben Jonson himself suffered inquisition and torture at the hands of the Elizabethan administration, let's call it, for some of the things that he wrote.
Was De Vere ever himself questioned? You said it was kind of a known secret. So did he ever kind of get put on the block for these works?
Not for his writing.
Interesting.
He was put on the block a couple of times. In fact, he was thrown in the Tower of London and locked in the Tower of London at the Queen's command. So yeah, he was definitely no stranger to trouble. He was accused of being a heretic. He was also accused of being a Catholic sympathist. So I don't know how you connect those two together. Either you're
right. Yeah.
Whatever. Make up your mind.
He was accused of sodomy, which was a thing.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things is you could sleep with anyone and everyone you wanted to, as long as you didn't get caught and as long as there wasn't evidence, right? And he ends up in bed with one of the Queen's ladies in waiting and sires a child by her. And
that's evidence right there.
He ends up in the Tower of London over that incident.
Wow.
And it's interesting that, the Queen locks him up and decides on his fate. Eventually she releases him and lets him go.
How long was he up there?
I don't know the exact amount of time.
I say up there because it's like he said Tower of London. So I'm thinking like, oh, he was way up high where Rapunzel stays. Like that's where my brain went when you
most likely he was not at the top of the tower.
Yeah, I know, but
but he was definitely locked in. Earl of Southampton ends up locked in that tower as well over a little incident called the Essex Rebellion, where he and the Earl of Essex are both implicated in an attempt to overthrow the Queen.
Wow.
Essex ends up dead. Southampton is spared. And there's evidence that it is Edward de Vere who is his number one champion and who urges the Queen to spare his life.
The same person who works were dedicated to.
The guy who the first two poems are dedicated to.
That's so fascinating. Wait, can I go back for just a moment here? Because I have another question about something you'd said. You were saying if it was the man from Stratford, then he wouldn't, he would have been put on trial. Awful things would have happened. why didn't that happen? If his name was so close and people didn't know who the real author was, but they clearly knew that this person existed.
There was no connection at the time. That's the only answer. The only answer is there was no connection between this man from Stratford and the works of William Shakespeare at the time that those works were being first presented in quarto form and in Stationer's Registry. That's where you would go and register your play before you would perform it.
Understood.
Right. So
almost like you needed to get the approval of
nearly every other, there's a great scholar on this, and she's been a guest on one of our previous episodes about Shakespeare's The Will of the Man from Stratford, Bonner Miller Cutting. And she's done a great deal of research on the writers of the time and the torture and the inquisitions that they suffered.
Right.
And it's interesting because she points out that nearly every major writer was called in at one point or another before the spy masters of England to question them about their writings. Did they know something about somebody else's writings? And many of them were tortured, some of them to the point that it caused them death, and some of them later on early death because of the tortures that they suffered. And we're talking like racking, binding. We're talking like medieval torture.
Yeah.
Literal
legit
medieval
torture.
One writer is never called in to account for anything he ever wrote.
William Shakespeare.
Now, how do you... Here's an answer. You can't call in a man who doesn't exist.
Right. That is,
that's fascinating.
Fascinating. It's also, go ahead. You got a thing?
It's your thought may be more on this track. I have kind of a separate question.
Go for it.
Go for it. What do you got?
How do you, or if you don't really have your own thought about it, how do you summarize like Oxfordians approaching the idea of like multiple authors?
I think it's very likely.
Yeah.
And I think that this clouds the issue for those who are seeking the truth of this. I think that it gets a little murky from one play to another in certain instances because I think there is evidence that there were other hands involved in some of the works.
Whoa.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite possible even that there were hands involved in some of the works after Oxford dies.
Which is what they say about, Stratford as well.
So, whoever had these manuscripts in their possession prior to them being published. So Oxford dies in 1604.
Yeah.
Right? It's not till 1623, remember, that this folio is published.
Right.
So there's a huge gap of time.
Yep.
So in that nearly 20 years, where are these manuscripts? Where have they been? Whose hands have they been in? Have they been in the hands of the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery? Most likely. That makes sense. But there's another person who has been proposed as a candidate for authorship who stands up there really high outside of Bacon and Marlowe, and he's the Earl of Derby.
Okay.
And he, guess what, is married to another of Oxford's daughters.
Wow.
So now
So
we have
he is another son-in-law.
another
Oxford
son-in-law
had a
of
lot
Oxford. He had 3 daughters.
Right.
And so here we have an instance of another son-in-law who is connected to the works of Shakespeare by a lot of people who believe that he may have had a hand in the writing.
And I asked the same question again. Is there anything that he has written that is accredited to him under his own name?
There's some stuff.
Okay,
yeah.
so there is some stuff.
Yeah.
Unlike Oxford, where there's just nothing.
Well, Oxford, we have
right.
all this early stuff and then silence from forever after that.
Right.
As far as writings, the only things we have after Oxford's early poetry are things that he wrote, such as like prefaces to other publications.
Oh, gotcha. Right.
Or forwards,
forwards
to other publications that he supported or that he financed.
Right.
So getting back to your question about like this group author theory, Oxford was also known for having a collection of writers at his disposal for a time. He rented... leased, I suppose is the proper term for back then, right?
Right.
A property called Fisher's Folly that he sort of turned into like his own private writers club, and famous writers who later on published some of their own works, who we know, like Anthony Munday, John Lilly. These are guys who basically served as secretaries to the Earl of Oxford. And it's the belief of many Oxfordians that these guys were learning their trade as writers from him under his tutelage as this collective, sort of an Algonquin club of writers. If you know the history of the Algonquin Club, like Dorothy Parker and all of those, it was sort of like this, group of artists, writers who sat together, and it wouldn't be, I mean, you two are artists. How often do you collaborate with other artists on ideas and storylines and whatever? So it's not far-fetched that these guys would sit around drinking ale or drinking mead or drinking flagons of wine and talking about stories and sharing pages and editing each other's works and revising each other's works.
Also, especially after the fact. Now, I'm come from the world of film. All right, I'm a filmmaker, and I have written a movie and put the movie out there. People know not to walk up after the finished product is done and say, "Hey, you know what you should do? You should change this." Yeah, that is unacceptable because that work has already been done and it is too late. But inversely, so working on a play or even just rehearsing for a movie before something is actually rolling. That I feel is where most of the collaboration comes from. That's where, I didn't realize this when it was in my head. It wasn't until I got it on its feet and I saw it being acted, and I saw it being blocked, or I heard it actually coming out of another person's mouth that I realized, this thread hasn't been pulled yet, or this line is unnecessary, or it doesn't work, or it needs to be changed. And I feel like if the idea is that after the works have already started being published, that they were altered, then there has to be multiple. There have to be people who have had their hand in the work of Shakespeare, because what art is ever that completely and totally pure?
Well, I think that's a good point. It's hard to say to what degree other people had more than just a suggestion to add to them, or the reworking of a scene, or, from an editor's perspective. I spent 12 years in journalism as an editor at both weekly and daily newspapers. And, a writer sends you a story, you go through it. Maybe you move this sentence here or that quote here, or you cut this out or cut that out for size. Like certain that kind of aspects,
more of an editor
proofreading type of aspect of it certainly was probably the case. But we have a number of plays in the Shakespearean canon that we have multiple versions of. So for some plays, we have what we call like the first quarto, and a quarto was basically like it's called a quarto because it was a page folded in 4 parts. And
makes sense.
And it was basically like what actors today might use is like a handheld script.
There's sides.
Sure. It was like a version of the play that was all in just one book, one play, not the folio that has, 36 plays.
Right.
So we have these quarto versions, and most of the earlier quartos are not published with anyone's name on them.
Oh.
So they don't say William Shakespeare on them. We just later know that they're a Shakespeare play because they're so much like what the finished product in the folio is that we go, that's an early quarto version of this same play.
Even if it had differences, the idea is like, here's an earlier version.
Many editors today, when they produce a copy, like say Hamlet, for instance. So with Hamlet, we have quarto 1, quarto 2, folio 1, folio 2. There's 4 versions of this play, and sometimes you'll have editors who will combine them the best they can, and they'll always make a little note. Sometimes it'll just have like a Q1 or a little asterisk that leads to Q1. This is the Q1 word. Q2, it's this word. There are some differences and changes. The second quarto version of Hamlet, the Q2 version of Hamlet, we call that the bad quarto because it's bad.
I'm gonna start referring to most of my work as the bad quartos. Yeah, that's my bad quarto.
Yeah, some people argue that these are acting versions, or that they're versions that actors wrote down from memory, and that's why they're bad. My argument is that they're drafts.
Right.
And that's how writers work.
And that's allowed. Yeah. It's that happens.
And here's the thing, here's the thing about so many Stratfordians is not only do they want to believe, they just so want to believe that this commoner from this country town with no formal education could grow up and be this brilliant writer, but they also want to believe that he never blotted a single line,
right,
that he never rewrote anything, that there were no drafts at all.
It's also just the way an artist works. Like I get it. Like I understand the desire to accredit the work to the dude from Stratford because it's a beautiful story.
Well, it's very poetic, and it's what I was talking about earlier. Is
Right.
like the legend kind of always precedes the truth because people become obsessed with that
Right.
idea, you
Yeah.
know. But I think in this day and age, with all that we have access to, there's no excuse for us to not be questioning it.
Right.
So here's something that I love to argue when people talk about how romantic that idea is, right? That they call Oxfordians elitists, right? You're an elitist, you're a snob. You only want to believe that an aristocrat with a formal education could have possibly come up with these works. And I always say that genius is genius, and there's no mistaking genius. But genius requires environment. It's a case of nurture must match nature.
Sure.
If you took Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and you made him the son of a farmer in Siberia,
right,
he would have come up with the most fantastic way to plow frozen ground and grow potatoes.
Right.
He would not have been a great composer. But it just so happens that, guess what? Mozart was born into a family of musicians. His father was a music teacher in PS, the music capital of the world at the time.
Right.
So it's those combinations of things that give us Mozart. But also there are Mozart compositions that aren't as good as some of his other there's Juvenalia in Mozart's life too. Not everything he composed was wonderful.
Right.
So I think that's a really good argument. And then the other argument that I like to make with regards to the romanticism of it is, okay, you want so much to believe that this country guy, son of a glover, who never wrote a letter to anyone.
There's like no written...
We have no evidence of him ever writing even a "honey, I'll be home at 5" to
mind-blowing
to anyone ever.
Wow. That's crazy. Do we have letters? Sorry to interrupt, but do we have letters from other people from that era?
Oh, of course we do. Okay, so
it's not...
the Earl of Oxford was a very prolific letter writer, sometimes writing letters from Italy to England, and
so it's not a matter of like, oh, we don't have them because it's really old. We don't have them because
it's like, did he write ever? Is the question? I'm hearing. Yeah. Or like, and if this is the man that wrote it, then why isn't there literally a single piece of writing?
Not a single letter, 6 signatures that don't match.
So we have 6 different signatures.
And change the spelling of the name from one signature to another.
Oh man, it sounds like he was evading somebody who owed him money. That's what it sounds like. I change my signature every now and then.
Back to money.
Every couple
Actually, people he did get in trouble for evading taxes once. We do have record of that. There's a legal proceeding about that. And ironically, you say that about evading money. People evaded him who owed him money.
He was like a loan shark?
He was a moneylender. And there is an obvious obsession with money and property in the life of the Stratford man, because most of the documents we do have about his life come from legal documents, and many of them court cases where he was suing people to get money back that they owed him. And sometimes down to a few shillings. So apparently this like celebrity, huge money making writer was obsessed with a few shillings over some grain deals that went wrong. But couldn't sign the court documents himself.
It sounds to me like if he actually was a writer, it all would have been like Judge Judy small claims court dramas.
Yes.
Really,
you're right what you know.
A little trashy sounding.
God, or mob stories.
Here's the one I love the most, and I'll be curious to hear what you feel about this, Alexandra, as a modern woman. And that is, we do know this. Stratford's father, John Shakespeare of Stratford, signed his name with an X. He did not. He was illiterate. He did not know how to read and
if
write.
You're illiterate, you wrote an X because you didn't. Okay.
You used a mark. You signed your name with a mark.
Right.
Shakespeare of Stratford also had daughters. they also signed their names with a mark. It's very doubtful that they knew how to read or write. They could barely write their own names. So now I ask you this. If this romantic idea of this genius that pops up in Stratford learns at the grammar school of Stratford all that he needs to know about Greek and Latin and the world to write these magnificent plays, has risen above his family upbringing from an illiterate family, has gone to school and become educated and learned to read and write and writes these magnificent stories. P.S. I like to think probably one of the first feminist writers ever, because look at how much he empowers the women in his stories.
There's some beautiful,
every single play has a female character in it who embodies something that is against the norm of what society would have expected in that time period. Mm-hmm. He creates these magnificent characters such as Portia in Merchant of Venice, who disguises herself as a lawyer and proves that she knows more about the law than any of the men in the room. Right. Rosalind, who P.S. is the largest female role in Shakespeare in As You Like It, who dresses as a male in order to become a love guru to her own lover. And the advice she gives is so perfect and spot on. And you go on and on. Cleopatra, even down to Juliet, little 13-year-old Juliet, who stands up to her parents and says, "No, I am not going to marry this man I do not love. I would rather die if I have to." How does a man who creates these magnificent female characters and who also has daughters of his own fail to share those characters with his daughters, fail to teach them how to read so that they can enjoy these characters he created? He does not work for me.
He was very busy writing, it sounds
He was an a-hole then. Right?
But
and that doesn't preclude you. A lot of artists are. So it doesn't preclude you from being a great artist, but it destroys the romance of it, doesn't it?
Even worse. And if anything, I feel like the mystery of the authorship is far more romantic than just blatantly resigning to believing it's Stratford because of things like that, where it's like, oh, well, the more you dig, you're like, oh, this just it doesn't add up. And if it does, it sounds really disappointing. He's a loan shark. Like he's not a compelling person in that regard.
Is there? I know I'm jumping way back again just because these questions I have to ask them.
Sure.
Is there ever anything that even connects William Shakespeare to the presentation of a play? Like of a Shakespeare play where he was like, yeah, I was here at a Shakespeare play.
There are 2 documents that exist that I'm aware of. There may be more.
Okay.
As I'm not an expert on this part of the scholarship.
Sure.
But I know that there's at least one document that lists him as an investor in a theater.
Oh, okay.
Right. And so we do know that part of his money making involved investing in theater operations
show business,
in London.
Sure, yeah.
So we do have that.
Okay.
And then there is one reference of him being in a play. He is listed as an actor.
In a Shakespeare play?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. And I guess my question is like, there has yet to been a screening of my debut feature film, Pinch, that I have not been at because it's brand new and I'm getting it out there and I want to be able to do PR stuff and do a Q&A. And I guess my thought process is like, he had to have been at every
if it was him, he did not care. He didn't even care to make sure his name was spelled consistently or correctly, or that his name was even put on some of the publications. If it was him,
and you figure if the guy cared that much about money, I mean, my name is going to be on everything that I do,
and I'm going to get my share. I'm going to get my credit. If I'm going to sue someone over a couple of shillings for some grain, then I'm definitely going to make sure that I'm getting the money owed to me for everything I wrote and published.
It's just so fascinating to me that, like, it makes perfect sense that the misidentification happened. Like that to me is almost logical, more logical than the inverse, in my opinion. Like, yeah, obviously it happened. It makes perfect sense. But the fact that it remains and that it's so continually perpetuated is mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling. And it to me, it's like fanatical almost. It's like disturbing the level. And people get really upset. Like
they do.
When I first heard about the Oxfordian theory, it's like, it actually just piqued my interest. Like I didn't get all offended all of a sudden. Like, how dare you question this? And it's like, I feel like people out there get really angry, and I don't understand that.
There's a legitimate animosity apparently towards a lot of people who question the authorship.
There is, and I have felt some of it, some from my own friends. Obviously, I know a lot of theater people.
Yeah.
I'm involved with a lot of actors, directors, producers on a regular basis. Many of them are classical theater people. Many of them have a love for Shakespeare. One of my best friends and I go round and round about this. And the thing is he will not do the research.
It won't budge.
Right? He's kind of like your English professor who goes, we're not even going to talk about that. He's dismissive about it. He won't read a book. If I give him a book on it, he won't read the book. He does not want to question it. He doesn't want to know.
It's just blind faith, really.
The mere thought process that all is not pure is just simply hard to swallow. It's religion. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's even, it can be, I think it was Mark Twain who called it bardolatry.
Yeah.
For the first time.
Yeah. I've heard that phrase.
And I think for some people, it is this sort of zealous connection that they have to it, that it shakes the foundation of their being, to suddenly have to accept that something that they've been told by so many people that they respected throughout their lives, including people in great positions of authority. Like you talked about how you blindly drank the Kool-Aid when this professor said, that's it and that's it. Well, he had power over you.
Right.
You need a grade in that class.
Yeah.
That is not a democratic system. That is a benevolent dictatorship. And if you displease the dictator, you could get your hands cut off.
Right.
It's living very much the same way that people lived under the Queen of England. And in that case, your professor became the Queen of England and said, we will not talk about this, period.
We are Protestants now.
Exactly. Yes, very good. That's a great example.
Yeah.
Right. And so for some people, it is very much like that, where they feel like it will shake the rest of what they believe to be true.
Which I think is fascinating, because it's not like I'm saying to you, hey, do you know all those plays? They don't make sense, or they're not real plays. Like, it's not like I'm taking away. It's simply being like, hey, I wonder if that was written by a different person. Like, it's not. It's just, that's what's bizarre to me, is that you're not changing.
The works are still separate. You can still enjoy all the works and never think about the author at all. Is kind of what you're talking about.
I would wonder if somebody was like, hey, did you know that Orson Welles was actually, another dude, another artist that was just like using that. Like,
hey, did you know that Orson Welles was an Oxfordian?
Was he really?
He sure was.
That's a great.
I didn't know that.
P.S. Yes, he was an Oxfordian.
But I guess that's my point. Is like, it's weird because it's not. The question isn't about the art. It's about like, oh, who wrote this awesome stuff? That's still awesome.
Well, I think what happens is, in my experience, like studying English and like in college anyway, and even after, I think when you're down that academic path, people become very obsessed with, like, once you've heard it, it's like you were talking about, people in authority. When something just is repeated enough that you're not going to question it. It's about falling in line, really, and the second you do is the second, like, all the foundation's going to start crumbling or something. I don't know.
But then there's also the aspect you talked about, Jake, where you said he's sort of like Mickey Mouse. And in a lot of ways, there have been a lot of people who have gone to great lengths to turn him into a cartoon.
Right.
You look at that image that we so associate with what we believe is what he looked like. Even the man from Stratford didn't look like that.
Right.
That classic iconic image that comes from that famous engraving in the first folio called the Droschet engraving, which has been torn apart and picked apart by artists of all kinds and scholars of all kinds as being a joke in itself.
Right.
And if you look at it, it's a Mickey Mouse cartoon. Sure. It's a cartoon drawing. And we've put it on everything, right? Coffee cups and mouse pads and T-shirts, and there are pictures of him with sunglasses now, and there are pictures of him sort of done in the Andy Warhol type of look to it.
He's a Halloween costume.
He is. He's an action figure. I have a Shakespeare action figure, and it's that bald head holding a quill and a book.
Right.
A few years ago, I went to the Folger Library in DC, and there was a whole exhibit on him and Jane Austen and like their pop culture influence over the decades. And it was that sort of stuff. I mean, lunchboxes and just,
Kitsch,
man,
pop
it's
art.
Wild what's out there.
Are you familiar with the term adoru?
A what-do?
Adoru, I-D-O-R-U.
I adore you too.
Oh. It was actually back when I fancied myself a musician for quite a few years, and actually it was the name of my band when I was in my early 20s, and I got it from another William author, William Gibson, who's a sci-fi. He's credited for creating cyberpunk as a genre.
Okay.
Like that retro futuristic 80s cyberpunk stuff. Anyways, he had a book called Adoru, and I think the word actually is specific to Japan. I think it means like a Japanese idol, but the idea is that it's a synthetic idol. Like in this cyberpunk futuristic world, there is a massive star, this pop star, movie, everything, and they are not a real actual person. They are a synthetic creation. There was a movie, speaking of Al Pacino, that Al Pacino made that was loosely based on it called, I want to say it was called Simone or something like that, where it was like this blonde woman and she wasn't real. She was like vaguely.
Yeah.
But the idea, I guess what I'm getting at is like, that's sort of what it feels like.
He's an avatar.
It feels, even better. Yeah. Like that's what it reminds me of is it's this face and identity to put on a work because it's the most easily accessible, which is weird because it seems like the most easily accessible would be literally any of the other potential authors who all seem to have more evidence. So
let me tell you a couple of other quick little fun ones just to kind of get your brains chewing.
Yeah,
right?
This is fascinating.
So at one point, and I forget the year that this happens, and if I had one of our other scholars here in the room, they would know this. I love it when we're filming an episode with our experts, and I'll say, I kind of recall, and they go, this date, and I'm like, thank you. You're my walking encyclopedia.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I don't recall the year, but I do know that this is a fact. The Queen Elizabeth, out of the blue, issues a 1,000 pound per year annuity to the Earl of Oxford. It's a 1-paragraph edict that is written with her signature on it. And it basically says, I'm paraphrasing, that he is to receive this 1,000 pounds per year in perpetuity, meaning forever, 1,000 pounds a year, and he must make no accounting for it.
Tax-free.
And he doesn't have to report to anyone what he's using the money for in any way whatsoever.
Wow.
And neither does it specify what she was giving it for?
No, not at all. And P.S., in today's dollars, that's about $1 million per year out of the national treasury.
That is a good deal.
For him to use however he sees fit and without ever having to make an accounting for it. Now, my argument, and an argument of a lot of scholars who point this out, is that sounds to me like $1 million a year propaganda machine to me. And if you look at the plays as a whole, especially the history plays, they are nothing if they are not propaganda. They are the biggest collection of nationalist propaganda in the history of writing.
Interesting.
They are pro-Tudor, they are pro-monarch, they are pro-England. And I'd say it'd be worth $1 million a year to have that going on. He was her PR man in that sense, is one argument that could be made.
I mean, the writer in me immediately went like, oh, this is what he has to do to answer for the criticisms or for the things that were in his works that were maybe a little bit less than approved by the Queen.
She unleashed the hound, right? So as soon as you give him $1 million a year to write what you say you want written, but he has to make no accounting for it. It pretty much gives him the ability to write whatever he wants.
Or it's like when the FBI hires the person who hacked into their FBI system because that's the person who's going to know how to stop the next guy.
And he does a bit of both, right? He does what she asks him to do, but then he also sends messages directly to her and members of the court through many of the plays as well, and sometimes poking several high-ranking members of the court right in the eye.
Which a great, brilliant writer would have the ability to do, of course.
Of course. The biggest one of that all scholars agree with is in Hamlet. And everyone agrees that the character Polonius in Hamlet is a direct lampoon of William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, the Queen's chief minister and advisor.
Okay.
Who, P.S., was Edward de Vere's father-in-law. And helped raise him.
So many connections.
I feel like every time you mention somebody else, by the way, it's 6 degrees from
from
the Earl of Oxford.
Yeah.
Here you have Hamlet and Ophelia and Polonius. Then you have Edward, his his wife Anne, daughter of Lord Cecil,
Right.
Lord Burleigh William Cecil. So there's an immediate correlation right there. Now you have Edward, who lost his father at a very young age, the age of 12 years old, to very suspicious circumstances. And people theorized that he maybe had been poisoned because of some decisions he was making about his lands and his earldom. And as soon as he died, guess who takes charge of all of his lands and everything? The queen, the court. And De Vere becomes a ward of the court. His mother hastily remarries, and he never speaks to her again.
So,
Wow.
So Hamlet's like a biopic.
Well,
Or
Hamlet, one of the best moments in Hamlet that makes no sense anywhere and is nowhere in any of the source plays or the original versions from Denmark or anything. One of the best moments in Hamlet, especially from a producer-director standpoint, is when he's captured by pirates. Right? There's that moment where Hamlet's coming home from England. He gets captured by pirates, and they drop him off in Denmark, leaving him naked on the shore. Once they learn that he's the Prince of Denmark, they decide, well, we're not going to kill him. We don't want that coming
We
down
don't want,
on us. They strip him of all his possessions and drop him naked on the shore. That actually happened to Edward de Vere upon his return to England.
Wait, really?
He was captured by Dutch pirates. They stripped him of everything and left him naked on the shore. The Queen, on his behalf, ended up petitioning the Netherlands to return some of de Vere's
Belongings.
personal belongings.
Can I ask how we know that and where that story comes from?
Because we have the extant documents and letters, including De Vere writing, I was captured by pirates, and that's why I'm delayed.
First-hand accounts.
Yeah, it's first-hand accounts.
So what you're saying is you write what you know.
Yeah.
it's a
Literally
pure moment directly from his life inserted into the play. And some of us, like for me as a producer director, I wish he had never ever done that, except for me as the Oxfordian. It's a great connection.
Right. True.
I mean, because I hate the pirates in Hamlet, and they inevitably will pirate your whole play because inevitably you have to cast actors who aren't the best actors in these tiny little pirate roles.
Right.
They come out, they stumble over the language, they chew up the scenery, and they ruin the show. And you end up spending far more of your time directing pirates than you do directing Hamlet.
I love that.
And it's a common thing among Shakespearean directors that when you're like dealing with stuff like that, somebody will come to you and say, how's the show going? You turn to them and say, I'm dealing with pirates.
It sounds to me like Shakespeare's still getting one over on you.
That's right. That's right.
Exactly.
I mean, you know what? And it's something that in every one of the things that I write for film, whether it be short films that I've done or my feature, there is always at least one scene that is something that's either specifically happened to me or my character recanting something that in real life specifically happened to me. And I do that exact same thing in my feature film Pinch. The character that I play recants a story about his mother, and it is just a story about my mother from my life. And it's a thing that you put in there because you've told the story before, and somebody's been like, wow, that's a crazy story. And you go, you know what? That's right. I'm going to put it in a piece of work I do. So
that's the specific reason why so many famous
no
writers have also been authorship doubters, including Mark Twain, including Walt Whitman. Many of them who point to and say, wait a minute, I know how I write. I know what my process is. I know how I think
makes so
and
much sense.
how no matter what I do, there's an autobiographical aspect to my writing, or there's at least themes or messages that I want to convey to the world or to the reader through the writing.
Or not even necessarily that you want to convey, but that you're forced to convey because it's your voice.
Right. We live in a day and age where people are asked to look rationally at the evidence, look around, look at the evidence around you with regards to climate change. Look at the evidence around you with regards to healthcare. Look at these are hot topics going on in our world today. Look at the evidence around you with regards to gender identification. We're being asked on all levels in so many ways to rationally step back and be objective and not emotional about what is the truth
and scientific,
and then accept that truth and move forward from there. This is one area where we continue to refuse to apply that new doctrine. And so part of this podcast series and a huge part of the mission of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship is to just get people to look at it objectively. And if you look at it objectively and you connect the dots, it starts to become very clear, even if it's not clear to the peripheral student of this issue, that it's Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, is the author. It is certainly clear that William Shakespeare of Stratford is not.
I would 100% agree with that, actually. Like just in like all the evidence, and I'm a pragmatic person. I think
You're very pragmatic,
I can't,
and you've been a little skeptical too, even when this podcast series started and I first talking to you about meeting Steve and meeting the Oxfordians.
I had so many questions. I'm like, wait, but why? And also, why not question it? And at the end of the day, I think what's most fascinating for me now is, okay, well, let's say it's not him then. I'm totally on board with saying that. That makes me want to know all the more about Edward de Vere.
Who was it then?
Yeah, and
Sure.
and I want to say, and you mentioned, of course, like there's the diciness of the politics of the time, but why else wouldn't he have wanted his name attached to the works too? And then where are the works? Are there any attached to him at all, like the physical copies in his family's possession, or
nothing? We have
it's
no
so amazing.
Wouldn't somebody that would be the smoking gun that we would all love to see, right? It's some manuscript written in Edward de Vere's handwriting, even a page, even a single page from a play or a poem published under the name of Shakespeare, written in de Vere's handwriting, would clinch it.
And even inversely, the opposite direction with Stratford, if you're a writer and everybody in town knows you're a writer, they're going to have you write stuff for them. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's what happens. You'd figure that everybody that knew the man from Stratford around that time would have things that they wrote for him. Hey, would you write me a poem? Would you write me this? Like,
all they saw him was what he was, a very shrewd businessman, land grabber, grain hoarder. He got fined for hoarding grain during a time where people were starving.
Oh my God.
Oh,
That's a true story. There's a legal document that exists. He was fined for hoarding grain. He, as we mentioned, sued people. He was a vicious money lender. And so look at some of the plays. Like, let's look at Merchant of Venice. It's obvious that the writer of the plays has a very poor opinion of money lenders.
Yes.
Right.
On
the one hand, you have Stratford, who was a money lender. On the other hand, you have de Vere, who was a money borrower most of his life and ended up mostly broke because he borrowed way too much and spent way too much. So it makes sense that this man would have a disdainful view of money lending. It doesn't make sense that this man would have a disdainful view of money lending, since he made so much money lending money. So there's just another one of those circumstances, and they go on and they go on and they go on. And I think that we're fooling ourselves if we don't believe that these questions need to be asked. We're fooling ourselves if we continue to believe the myth that has been continuously propagated over the last couple hundreds of years. And I think that in our lifetimes, we're going to see a paradigm shift on this. And someday it will have to be widely recognized that at the very minimum, we're not sure who the writer truly is. And we need to continue to seek information to find out the truth.
Totally see that. I think even just any writer out there should be ashamed of themselves for not questioning it, is my opinion. Because if you look, like, as a lover of the works themselves, they're just so deep in humanity and the reflection upon life and love and all of these wonderful themes. No way would a man who would hoard his grain when people are starving write that. Like, I'm very convinced for sure on that angle. You got me on that level.
I win. One more convert. Converting the world one Oxfordian at a time. But don't take my word for it. Go and do your own research. You can go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. There's a ton of information there. There are quite a number of magnificent books that are out there now on this issue about this man, about his life. If you read the life of the man and you read the works of Shakespeare, you will find the parallels are just astounding. And for me, as an artist who regularly produces, directs, and appears in these works as an actor as well, knowing what I know about de Vere's life, when I'm engaged in one of these plays, they become so much clearer to me as to what his motive was for creating these characters, for telling these stories, how his personal life is playing out through these stories. One of the most important things in his life that happened is he didn't want to marry his wife. He didn't want to marry William Cecil's daughter, Anne. He was opposed to the marriage. He fought it. It was forced upon him. He refused to consummate the marriage, and he ran away to Italy. His wife has a child, a little girl, that he says can't be his.
Oh.
We never consummated. How could she possibly give birth to a child by me? It's a bastard child. And when he returns, he refuses to acknowledge her or his daughter for years.
Wow.
For years. It is later explained to him that the marriage was consummated without his knowledge, that his father-in-law, prior to him leaving to go to Italy, knew that he had not planned to consummate the marriage with this wife, that he was concerned about the marriage not being consummated and needed it to be consummated because he wanted to have more control over De Vere's money. And that he arranged in a night of Edward's drunkenness to remove the mistress who Edward thought he was going to go to bed with and insert his daughter into the room.
Gosh, this sounds like a Shakespeare play.
You think? You know why it sounds like a Shakespeare play? Because it happens in not one, but two different Shakespeare plays. It's called The Bed Trick, and it's a primary plot mechanism of two of the Shakespeare plays.
Wow.
Measure for Measure and All's Well That Ends Well both have incidences where a woman is inserted into the bedroom unbeknownst to the man who thinks he's going to actually be sleeping with a different woman.
Yeah. You write what you know. I mean, like, that's the thing that keeps popping up, but it's true. And it's
later on, he accepted that as truth. He reunites with his wife. He reunites with his daughter. Right. Now let's look at plays like Winter's Tale.
Yes.
Where what happens at the end of that play after Leontes accuses Hermione of infidelity and disavows his child as being his own child. Perdita, who he sends out to be left in the cold and die. Later on, what happens? He's reunited with Hermione. He is reunited with his daughter, Perdita. That's not the only play that has this separation of father and daughter and reuniting of father and daughter. It's a very prevalent moment in King Lear.
King Lear, Cordelia.
Right? When Lear and Cordelia are reunited. It's also a huge part of Pericles. And Pericles is reunited with his daughter. It's a common theme because it's such a magnanimous moment in his life. It's such a huge part of who he is. So then when you're working on these plays and you come to these moments, you start to, like, it chokes me up. I want to cry because I go, oh my God, this is him apologizing to his wife and his daughter for being such a bastard all those years and finally giving in and reuniting with them. And now those works mean so much more to me.
Right. So your belief in Edward de Vere as the author of the work of Shakespeare actually makes the work better for you.
Absolutely.
It would have
incredible.
to, though, too.
Incredible.
I totally believe that because there's for works who we do know the author for, it does enrich that experience. Like any book I read by Jane Austen, I'm thinking about her life and, you know, all of the various factoids in her decisions and what she's trying to comment on. And that makes the work that much better, you know? So, you know, thinking of Edward de Vere and all his experiences or choices, I'm sure, you know, it's like as an actor or whatever you're doing with the works, it's going to make it a better experience. I mean, because then you understand more. Whereas if it's Stratford, where did this come from? Is it just his imagination? And if so, how did you even come to that, you know, thought process?
That's a great question. And I truly believe that as this issue comes more and more to the forefront of the public mind and it is more and more widely accepted and people are at least willing to open their minds and question and look at it from an objective position, I believe that there's going to be a resurgence in the popularity of the works of Shakespeare as people realize the life behind the works,
Right.
connect the life to the works, and it opens up the works in that much more emotional way for them.
Yeah.
And I think that Shakespeare festivals and classical theater companies across the country are missing out by not embracing this and not presenting the works from an Oxfordian perspective to open up that whole world of emotion, trial, tribulation, struggle, pain, loss, suffering that is there that connects to the works. And I think once we do that, it's boom.
It makes it, and honestly, it makes it more accessible to somebody who, again, I know some of the works, I know a little bit of it, but now having this information, I've been sold, and now I'm more interested. So it's like, from a strictly financial standpoint, it would be smart for the people that are perpetuating these festivals and honestly just the work in general, like to open that door, because you will definitely hook a lot more people, specifically people like me who are interested in that element of it as well.
And a whole new world of kitsch. You can start putting
who
Edward
knows?
de Vere's picture on everything, and then there can be Edward de Vere
Think
action
of the
figures.
marketing.
Heck, forget kitsch, movies, you know? I would see that movie. I would like to see the movie of the man who used a pseudonym, and the legend preceded the
Yeah.
truth of it for centuries.
Considering
There was a film not too long ago. Roland Emmerich made a film called Anonymous, and it is all about this issue. He takes basically every theory and crams them all into 1 2-hour movie, which is part of what's wrong with the movie.
undirected,
much.
unfocused. Maybe.
It's slam it all in there, regardless of how much evidence there is for every aspect of it or not. And I think that was like a Hollywood salacious aspect to it. I don't think you needed to make it any more salacious than it
Right.
already is
Yeah.
intriguing. And I think that's part of what was wrong with the film. I would argue that this is not a story that can be told in one movie.
No.
HBO,
HBO, get on
that's
this.
it, brother.
There you
That's
go.
exactly where I'm going.
Oh.
This
Get on
needs to
this.
be
Yes.
an HBO or a Showtime series.
Oh my
And
goodness.
could you imagine
Yes.
if each episode centered around a different play and pointed out the elements of his life that connect to that play? And if you suddenly understood where Romeo and Juliet comes from, the bitter rivalry that was going on between his family and the family of his love, his mistress.
Wait, so are you saying that it didn't come from the events of Shakespeare in Love, which we just watched the other night for the first time? It didn't come from that? No,
sorry.
Gwyneth Paltrow had nothing to do with it?
Gwyneth Paltrow had nothing.
Nor did Ben Affleck.
Not even, Ben Affleck with my favorite line in the movie? That's not how you're going to do it, is it? That's the best. I love that line.
There are Oxfordian jokes in that movie, by the way.
Are there really?
Yes.
Oh, see, now I have to
Yeah.
redig
Have
it.
to rewatch
Yeah,
now.
Tom Stoppard throws in a couple of little zingers in
Nice.
there about
Perfect.
the authorship question in that
Ooh.
movie. If you're listening for them, you'll hear them.
Delightful.
Well, I have an autobiographical question then about De Vere. Who would have been his dark lady?
Well, it's interesting that you would ask that question at the 2018 annual conference of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. There was a debate conducted between 3 of our top scholars on that issue.
Oh, wow.
And each of the scholars proposed a different woman for being the dark lady of the sonnets. And the 3 proposed candidates were Anne Vavasour, who was Edward de Vere's mistress, who did have an illegitimate child from him. His name became Edward Vere.
Go figure.
Then the other proposed candidate was Penelope Rich. And she's connected to a lot of these earls and members of court because she was such a gorgeous woman that everybody wanted to go to bed with her, and many of them did. And then the third proposed candidate is the queen herself.
Ooh.
Oh, wow.
At the end of the day, after each scholar made their presentation, there was an unofficial vote taken
Oh, that's
of
fun.
the scholars in the room, and Queen Elizabeth was the candidate who received the most support
Wow.
Interesting.
from the room.
Wow.
And I have to say, I was one of those who voted that way as well.
Wow.
I believe that the queen is the dark lady.
What was
And
That's
what's the difference in
fascinating.
age?
between Edward and Elizabeth?
Yeah.
Something like 14 years, I think.
Wow.
somewhere around that 14, 16 years. I want to say she was older.
Gosh.
That would
Ironically,
be so cool.
I really do want to see this movie.
I
I'm not
know,
gonna lie.
right?
I want a
This miniseries.
David Tennant playing.
she dies in
DeVere.
1603. He dies in 1604. So he only lived another year after her. She dies in 1603. King James becomes king. And P.S. he renews the annuity.
Really?
Yes, he
The
continues. He
$1,000 or the $1 million
continues.
dollars,
He
essentially?
continues the $1 million a year.
That's crazy. I gotta know.
When Edward dies, he orders a celebration of sorts for Edward de Vere and requests that several Shakespeare plays be presented as part of that celebration. When Edward de Vere's wife dies years later, he holds another celebration. Guess what's performed at the celebration of her death? Shakespeare's plays.
Wow. See, that's so fascinating to me. And then you just made me think of a question, which is, do you think anyone in the royal family or in any kind of really deep down family tree connection to De Vere would have documentation that would be helpful for the Oxfordian theory that maybe is just being held secret? And, you know, like, and this is kind of getting to conspiracy theorist zones, but I'm like, why?
Not
is there
now.
nothing?
No. If anyone could
maybe
find,
destroyed.
if anyone had in their possession, unless it's like really some sort of like, you know, what are those people? The Innumerati. What are they called? The
Illuminati.
Yeah, those
Illuminati.
guys. But Innumerati. That's a Comedia term. That's never mind. That's like the young lovers in Comedia.
Wrong podcast.
Yeah, wrong. Totally wrong. Those guys, the Illuminati, unless it's like some kind of, you know, Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown kind of a thing that they're sworn to never reveal. It would make no sense for anyone to continue to conceal any documentation that they might have. It's possible that people have something that they don't know they have it. That has happened over the years where people have gone, oh, I found this document. I don't know what it is. And it turns out to be a lost poem from someone or a lost document pertaining to something important. So that stuff can happen. And maybe there still is something out there. It does appear, though, that the original manuscripts, in whatever form they originally were in, are lost to us, and we have nothing. We have not a single thing, which is really surprising considering that there had to have been rewrites and revisions.
Absolutely.
That's incredible.
But there's none across the board. You know, so it doesn't really answer that question for anyone, whatever anyone's theory is. It's like we have no paper trail
for any potential author,
which is so frustrating.
It's crazy.
There's a great show. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I don't think it's on anymore. I don't even know if James Lipton is still alive anymore, for that matter. But there used to be a show called Inside the Actor's Studio.
Love that show.
It's a foundation for my podcast, Elaborate.
Okay, great.
Yeah, the thought process was I want to do a version of Inside the Actor's Studio for all artists, and that goes another level deeper than that show does. But I love that show so much.
Yeah, that show's great.
It's a wonderful show, and I tell actors all the time that they should watch episodes of it just to hear what some of the actors have to say to some of the answers. And for instance, many of the actors talk about choosing proper footwear for their character is one of the first things they do when they're working on a role. But, you know, he has that question that he always asks. He has a series of questions he always asks at the end. And one of them is, if there is a God, what do you want him to say when you meet him? And my answer has always been, the real Shakespeare was... fill in the blank, God. Tell me, please tell me.
Love it.
What is the truth? But I pretty much believe... I mean, it would take a lot to convince me otherwise that it's not Edward.
Right.
Yeah. Which
he's the guy.
Absolutely
even
fascinating.
after just our one conversation, I'm totally like seeing it. You know, I feel it. I mean, I can understand if there's other theories out there, and I'd be interested to hear those. But I mean, if I'm taking away anything again, it's definitely like Stratford. No way. Like that's the one thing I'm taking away. No doubt.
That's gonna be the quote. Stratford. No
way.
So I would say in closing and in wrapping things up, I would say that it's not only the greatest mystery of all time, but it's quite possibly the greatest tragedy of all time. That this man has not been given the credit he deserves for the works that he has created. And I think there are a lot of Oxfordians who feel a personal connection to his spirit, as it were,
Right.
in wanting to change that and wanting to right that wrong for him, for his sake, especially those of us who really love the works. I've produced 22 Shakespeare titles, more than 60 Shakespeare productions. Some of these characters I know intimately.
Yeah.
And I love them so much. And when I know that they came from his mind, his experience, his emotions, his pain in a lot of places, I feel for him and I feel for this travesty, and I want to do what I can to right the wrong.
Especially if the only reason he ever used a pen name was out of a protection standpoint. You know,
Absolutely.
like other than just like, oh, I specifically don't want the credit for these plays. If it was out of necessity more so than a desire, then it makes it even more tragic, because it's like, it's not that he didn't want the credit for them, it's that he couldn't take it.
Right. It's absolutely forbidden for him to take the
Oh,
credit.
that's tragic.
And that's happened in history for other authors too. And usually they end up getting that credit. And it's like, oh, and the saddest thing you take away is, oh, I wish they could have had, you know, notoriety in their time. But it's like, in this case, we don't even have that much, you know?
Look at the McCarthy era in this country and the blacklisted writers who had to write under pseudonyms or under somebody else. They had front people who put their name on it for them because they hadn't been blacklisted as communists yet, or whatever.
Right.
Like this is not that far removed from other times in history, including modern history, that writers have had to hide themselves and conceal themselves. Many times, writers of one gender or another creating names. You know, J.K. Rowling put J.K. Rowling.
Yep.
Because it was
Just because it was ambiguous.
And more appealing to boys, potentially. Yeah.
Wow.
It was ambiguous. You didn't know whether she was a man or a woman.
Which is so tragic, but
makes sense.
yeah, strategic.
Well,
It's the kind of thing writers think about.
Before we sign off today for today's episode, anything else that I can possibly answer for the two of you before you go?
I mean,
a million questions.
well, first let me say thank you so much for having us.
Yes,
I know that
thank
this
you.
has been a much longer episode than you usually do. I hope that it was only out of lack of desire to stop. Because
Absolutely.
honestly, I feel like we could do this for another 7 hours.
I'm sure we could,
Totally.
especially with me. My wife will tell you, absolutely, don't get me started. When she knew that I was going to be the host of this podcast series, she said, "Oh, that's perfect."
Right. Well, I guess if I had to, if I had one question in closing, it would be, outside of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, who presents this show, is there a definitive resource for you? Is there a specific book that you're like, all right, if you're interested in this topic, this is read this. I know that there's hundreds of them, so I'm putting you on a spot, but I guess if I had one.
I can tell you, I mean, I have a very expansive library on this.
But
and the book that I have given to people the most, as far as to try to turn them on to this or to encourage them to read this.
Yeah, that's Spark. I want that Spark.
It's Mark Anderson's book, which is called Shakespeare by Another Name. Now, it's a pretty thick book, and it's not super easy reading because it's a lot of dealing with the titles and the names and the personalities of Elizabethan England and the Elizabethan court, and understanding the machinations and the ins and outs of all of that. But it definitely paints the best, clearest picture of De Vere's life in relation to the way incidents in his life appear in the plays. And I think that that's what makes it so valuable.
That's compelling.
But I would say for like getting started on it, one of the best things to read is actually by Mark Twain. And it's a tiny little pamphlet of a book that you can now get in print again. It was out of print for quite some time, but you can get it now. And it's called Is Shakespeare Dead?
Oh, I love it.
Perfect.
I already love it.
Mark
Written
Twain.
by Mark Twain, Is Shakespeare Dead? And if you read that, he spells it out pretty clearly, very easily in his very Twainian, swift wit style, that there's, there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. So that's a great like entryway in. Mark's book is a very thorough and wonderful piece. Obviously going back to the original Oxfordian, I mean, truthfully, the original published Oxfordian is J. Thomas Loney, spelled Looney. Yes, I know.
That's unfortunate.
It always has been for
That's
100
unfortunate.
years.
Oh.
And we're about to reach the 100th year anniversary of his book, which is called Shakespeare Identified.
Wow.
And that's like the
was
father
right.
of the movement, so to speak. So
Yeah.
that's a great book.
Only 100 years old.
Yes.
Gosh, that's crazy.
Charlton Ogburn is another one. And his book was in the 1980s. And there's a great TV broadcast, a PBS broadcast that interviews him. And it's interesting because when I first saw that, I was like, kindred spirit. He literally starts to choke up as he's talking about this. And he's coming from that place of going, this man lived this incredible life and poured his whole heart and life into these works and then got stripped of the credit. Right. And you can see Ogburn's emotion as he's describing it. And I think that's how a lot of us feel about it. So that's also a great source. And then I had someone turn me on to a publication of the Tennessee Law Review, which was an anthology of articles by different scholars and legal experts on the different aspects of the issue. And that was very insightful and really opened my eyes a lot as well.
Well, you cheated.
That's helpful.
You cheated because I asked for one, but I'm going to allow it.
No, it's good to have a variety,
those all
you know?
sound great.
So those are a few that you can look
appreciate
into. And of
that.
course, there are plenty. If you type in Shakespeare Authorship Question into your Amazon search bar, you're going to get a ton of options there. And you'll find people who are experts on the sonnets, people who are expert on the tragedies, the histories, the comedies, his early life, his juvenile. Like there's
breaking it all down.
There's
Incredible.
a ton of information out there now, and there will only be more and more information as more and more people embrace this as the truth.
I would love to know more about the connection to the sonnets.
Oh yeah.
That was probably my entryway outside of like Romeo and Juliet. Like when you're young and you're like, oh, this is so pretty. And you don't understand half of it, but you just love it.
Almost every scholar I've ever talked to on any side of the fence believes that the Earl of Southampton is the fair youth of the sonnets.
Wow.
And
that
so
makes it all the richer. That's so interesting.
Trying to understand the relationship between the writer, the Earl of Southampton, and the Dark Lady.
Yeah.
And if she's the queen, then trying to understand that relationship between those three people is a huge part of the sonnets. Hank Whittemore has a magnificent book about that as well, as some others who have done great study on the sonnets. So
amazing. My mind is blown.
Good. Thank you guys for being here today.
Thank you.
We're so glad
Thank
that you could
you.
be our guests. It's always nice to speak to fellow podcasters who have their own strengths and issues that they are passionate about, to come in and talk to me about what I'm passionate about. If you'd like to find Jake or Alexandra on a podcast, they'll tell you right now how to do that.
First off, if you're on social media, find me on Twitter at LiquidJake.
You can find me at Alexandra Hoey.
Alexandra and I both do a podcast that is our D&D podcast, a role-playing game, a D&D inspired live-action role-playing game that we record. We edit it down to sound like an audiobook, and then we release it out into the world, people's entertainment.
Now, how do I get invited to be a special guest on that?
Next season, we'll make that happen. That podcast is called Dungeons and Dragon Wagon, obviously a play on Dragon Wagon Radio,
Sure.
The network that we are on. And I also have a podcast of my own called Elaborate, which you can find at elaboratepodcast.com. And Elaborate is a one-on-one sit-down profile show not too dissimilar to the aforementioned Inside the Actor Studio, in which I have actors, writers, musicians, artists of all types and sizes. In fact, I would love to have you come and sit and do an episode with me one day soon, Stephen.
Absolutely.
So yeah, make sure you check out. And if you're following Dragon Wagon Radio at It's Dragon Wagon on all social media, you'll see all the great shows that we offer.
And find additional episodes of Don't Quill the Messenger right at that same location, Dragon
Absolutely.
Wagon Radio. And please be sure to download the other episodes. Be sure to give us a rate and a review if you would. 5 stars only. Thank you very much.
You can leave any star you want. Just leave a good review. At least.
Just leave stars. Yeah. Please leave stars. And let people know what you think about the podcast. Be sure to contact us and let us know what you think. You can find me very easily online. I'm at Archway LA, because I am, of course, don't forget, the artistic director of the Archway Theater Company here in Southern California. So you can find me through archwayla.com or Archway LA. So be sure to download those other episodes. Watch for additional episodes to keep coming every 2 weeks. Check out ShakespeareAuthorshipFellowship.org, your source and resource for additional information about the Shakespeare Authorship Question. And as always, don't forget, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.